In this lecture, we are going to look at some of the other properties in the return object from useQuery. And in here, I'm in the React query docs for useQuery. So we're going to use some of these other properties as indicators for when the data is not yet ready, so that we can do the right thing rather than throw an error because data is undefined. The specific ones that we're going to be looking at now are isLoading and isError. These are Booleans that tell us whether we are loading the data and whether there's been an error retrieving the data. So let's start applying these to the code. We can destructure isError and isLoading off of that same return object. And now, instead of checking if the data is falsy and returning an empty div, we can check if we are loading. And if we are, we can return, let's say an H3 that says loading. All right, let's look and see how that looks. So here we are in the app, and we're not getting an error, so that's definitely a good thing. If I refresh it, maybe something happened it was hard to see. So a tool that I like to use here is I'm going to open up my Dev Tools, and in the Network tab, I can, under this No Throttling, I can say maybe I'm on a slow 3G network. So that'll slow things down enough for me to see what's actually happening. So if I refresh, first we're loading, and then we finally get the data. So while we're in that loading state, we get that is loading. While we're loading, we get the early return with this loading indicator. And then once we're not loading anymore, once isLoading is false, then we'll return all of those post titles and the rest of our page. Now you may have noticed that in addition to isLoading, we also get isFetching. And I want to talk about what the difference is between isLoading and isFetching. IsFetching means that the asynchronous query, it hasn't resolved. We haven't yet completed, in this case, our fetch, but it could also be an Axios call or some sort of GraphQL call as well. That's isFetching. isLoading is a subset of that. isLoading means we are in a fetching state. Our query function hasn't resolved yet, but we also have no cached data. We've never made this query before, and so we are both fetching and we don't have any cached data to display. That's the difference between isFetching and isLoading. In this case, it might not seem to make that big a difference, but as we look at pagination, we'll see that we really want to distinguish between when we have cached data and when we don't. Okay, so that's isLoading. Let's take a look at isError. So if we actually got an error from our fetch posts, from our query function, then we'd also not have any data. Data would be undefined, and so we would want an early return. So we can now return something went wrong. All right, and I can make something go wrong by typing some junk in here. So here now we're seeing this, oops, something went wrong, and I can refresh it just to see what's going on, just to watch it in slow motion because I'm still on slow 3G. You can see it's loading for a while, and it actually tries 3 times before it gives up. That is something that is configurable, but by default, React Query will give it 3 tries before it decides that we cannot get that data. So while we were trying, we got loading. After it was done, we got our error. In addition to returning a Boolean isError, the return object also has the actual error that was thrown by our query function. So I can take that error, and here I can put it in a paragraph. And it's unhappy because we don't have a parent component here, or excuse me, a parent element. So let's just give it a fragment. So now we can see what the error actually is. Let's see how that looks. Oh, we saw it for a minute. We are actually refetching as a consequence of refocusing the window. We'll look at that later as to the configuration for that. But now we got this type error, failed to fetch. There are more sophisticated things you can do when you get errors. There is an on-error callback that you can pass as an option to useQuery. And we're going to do that in our larger project so that we can display the error more elegantly. Let's clean this up so that we are no longer generating errors when we don't need to. And I'll see you in the next lecture where we will install and investigate React Query's dev tools.